I'd like to welcome everybody to another edition of BASE Cybersecurity Institute webinar. Today we're going to be talking about autism and cybersecurity. And to get us started, I'm going to hand it over to Thad Perry, who is one of our founding members and super volunteer. Thad, would you like to take it away?
Very good. Thank you very much, Diana. I'm going to spend some time today talking about cybersecurity and autism, but some other things surrounding that. And that's how do we get out of the logic box we tend to be in, and how do we solve the biggest problem we have? I've told a lot of people in cybersecurity and BCI that my biggest frustration in this field is there's so many bad players. And how do we fight so many bad players? As we saw in SolarWinds, you got 1,000 people trying to hack into your software and get in there. It's a tough battle to win. So I'm going to talk a little bit about perspective and history before we get into the details of autism, but I want to make sure we have the relationship. So as I address my frustration, how do we win, so to speak, against adversaries that outnumber us greatly? I go actually back to MBA school, which might have been a long time ago for me, but often since in my consulting role with Accenture and a leader there, I worried about the same thing. And I remember this book of the 5 Rings by Musashi. And I thought maybe I'd talk about it a little today, because the thing that hit me most was, how do 1,000 warriors defeat an army of 10,000 or 20,000 warriors? And it's a very interesting problem. And so I turned with cybersecurity and said, we got that problem. How do we win against those people that are going against us at the time? And there's can be lots of them out there. So, if I go back to that learning of Musashi, I thought I'd bring up, he wrote the 5 Rings and what the 5 books are, and a little bit about what it means to us, because if you take a look at the background of the people and BCI and Becky herself, you begin to see characteristics of the type of people that are fighting the challenge and how they're doing it. So Musashi, the book of 5 Rings, he wrote the 5 rings are, by the way, earth, fire, water, wind, and void. So if you think about the area of earth, that's what we think about most. That's being grounded. And Musashi talked about the fact that you got to be grounded. You have to know what you're doing. Whatever your task at hand is, whatever your specialty is, whatever you're trying to accomplish, you need to be in the details, the minute details. You have to look at every possible thing that's going on, and you have to analyze your own strengths and weaknesses, and you have to figure out how I can counter those weaknesses I have, turn them into strengths. And how can I defeat somebody else that in numbers is a lot stronger than I? So what do I do? And so this is sort of the shoguns, or actually the samurai's solution to the MBA school. He says we start with grounding things, and we got to do research. We have to understand our adversary, and that adversary is very impacted by the communities that they're a part of, which something we call today culture and community. And of course, individuals have culture, and we're going to get to that a little bit later when we talk about autistics. So if you start with the concept of I need research, grounded, it's all about context. If I can change the context of the game. And he used to go into battle, he'd show up at the very last second, always on time, of course. Good Japanese timekeeper, but always on time, but at the last second. And he would come and he'd look very different than anybody. He'd look disheveled. He'd look scary. And he would walk into the battle and immediately battle. So he he had a strategy of, I think, over 300 times he was challenged. You know, when you're a samurai, you either win or lose, and losing isn't good because you never have a chance to win or lose again. So he used this stage of being prepared, changing the context, knowing your adversary, know their strengths. I'm going to talk about a little bit of that as a second topic here when we get into culture. But so Earth is a very important grounding, and we learn a lot what we're doing in cybersecurity related to how he described how you have to ground yourself and know your skill and fine-tune your skill and practice and pay attention to details. And of course, his concept of fire, I'm not going to say anything much about except that's intensity. You know, fire can be big or small, but it can be hot and it can be intense. And his view is intensity is a key to battle. You have to be intense about what you're doing, so focused you don't move away. And now we see another reason why we have high functioning autistics working related to us. But I think one of the most interesting areas, I think this is the leading area, is his ring on water. You know, water is something that moves, it changes shape and dynamic. It has a lot of power. Ground and a square is a square. There's no squares in water. What could be a square right now could be a circle or an oval in a minute from now. And I think the new frontier in cybersecurity is a switch from static data and static response, which is what we mostly have. We put up our barriers to entry, and we're trying to look at the data, analyze the data, figure out what to do about it. And if something's happening, we look at that event, we attack that event. Well, that's more ground. Now, water, Musashi says you have to be dynamic as a battle goes on. And as people change, the community change, and the players change, you have to be dynamic. So we need to look at data dynamically and response dynamically. And I think this is a new frontier. So it's worth reading him to look at how he talks about water, because I think this is where the industry has to go to really combat how we as 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people can fight 10 million people. That's a very good thing. Wind is something I won't discuss too much, but that's technique. And technique's a big part of what we do, analyzing somebody else's in ourselves. But I think Void that's the last book, and it has to do with mindset. And you got to look at history, and you have to be intense and focused on what you do. An important message he had is, you know, you got to focus on what you know, but you have to imagine what you don't know. Because the real threat comes from what you don't know and don't understand. And certainly Becky understood that, and that's why you see one of the objectives and pillars is research and education of the BCI. And that's something she believed in wholeheartedly. And she was a real, believer in collaboration and sharing and research. So looking at what doesn't exist and what you don't know is the space we're all trying to deal with. And how do you imagine that? And how do you create mechanisms to do that, to quick respond on something that's happened that you haven't experienced before, but you've looked at that scenario and you've developed a plan. It's a whole concept of scenario planning, but at a different level. So much for Musashi, but we can learn a lot about how 1,000 people army can beat an army of 10,000 people. And we can go back to this 1600 when Musashi was living and really put his principles together, and we can learn something. But let me talk a little bit about why we're looking at this topic. Why is BASE Cybersecurity Institute looking at autism and cybersecurity? Well, first of all, let's start with Becky. We've talked about her before. She's sort of considered the mother of cybersecurity. She was in this from the get-go. She was a pioneer. And she had a vision, but she knew how to stick with the vision, how to develop it, make something happen with it. So, a question I've asked is, where'd she get that? Where'd she get that grit? Where'd she get that vision? Well, let's figure out something about her. She was born in mid-50s. By the mid-70s or before that, she was in high school. And her father was a Teamster union worker in Alabama. Her mother was a Japanese bride. So as you look at her, she's a Japanese American. However, she grew up in a period of extremely high prejudice against Japanese Americans, which, by the way, is something that's happening again today, much to my surprise, but happening today. So she fought like hell, prejudice, and people looking at her differently and pushing her away. And then you add to this that she was an epileptic. And the doctors that she saw and the educators all said, we'll talk about that later. This person, she miswired in here, something wrong with her head. And, what she needs to do, she's an epileptic. She's a minority, but also importantly, she's a woman. She can't possibly have the grit to get over that disability and survive. Quite interesting. So her doctor said she should go on Social Security and just live off the system. But a lot of other people said, oh, that's different. And Becky said, no way. And she applied for scholarships. She applied for money. And she applied to the engineering school at the University of Alabama. Now, the interesting thing, she was the only female in engineering school. The only female. She got in there. They said, well, there's a lot of pressure on us. We got to let somebody in, but she'll never last. She'll never have the grit. Well, they underestimated her because she had a lot of grit. And so she overcame a lot, really. So you take a look and say, man, that's one reason we've honored her with this BCI. Importantly as well, she had a son that was autistic. And the interesting thing she talked about is, you take a look, how do I deal with my kids who's autistic? How do I train them? How do I get them, to understand, to grow? And Becky said, you'd be amazed how much I learned from my son. And that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later today. So she had a very stellar career. I'm sure a lot of people know who Kevin Metnick is. Kevin is sort of the number one hacker we think of in the US and has been for a long time. But Becky was instrumental in uncovering and catching this guy because she understood traceback and capture. And she took theory in cybersecurity and she applied it in practice. And she's the person that caught this guy, who's now, of course, multimillionaire and one of the biggest consultants in cybersecurity. But it shows a lot about her and what she had. And we in cybersecurity have to be able to think outside the box. And, I think key message here is we have to embrace diversity. Certainly she did, and she was. So if you think about that message and what she looked at too, is she ended up talking about culture. And, as a consultant and somebody ran a large practice, I had 4,000 consultants, but they were across 9 different countries. And we did lots of projects and we had lots of Americans working then as well. And one thing I found out is people from different countries are different. They have the same values and goals that we had in the US, and we had within Accenture, but they were different. And at the time, we hired Hofstede to help us understand culture, because Hofstede did the study with IBM, saying, well, that's a constant. Excuse me, and they're every place. And let's take a look at what's the differences between those people, and we sort of understand culture. And he looked at things like power distance and uncertainty, avoidance, and collectivism versus individualist, long-term focus, masculine, feminine, and sort of indulgent, which certainly most people in the world consider we as Americans are the highest in the world on indulgent. But if we look at the Chinese and the Russians, they have a very different view of power distance than we have. They believe in this top authority, and they have the authority. We don't quite believe in that here. Importantly, they sort of, in those countries, act collectively. So those people are following a message. I just saw this week where, one of the top diplomats in China said, we didn't permit the last 0-day issue, so we're reeling that back in. We don't want them to do that much. I mean, it tells you how much they could do and underneath what they are doing. And this is the collective response. Now, the US is individualistic. When you just think about those and that long-term thinking, we're not as long-term thinking. These other places are long-term thinking. And, Solar Winds was 3 years in the making. They worked 3 years. They're patient. We don't tend to have patience in our culture. So we have to understand who's attacking us and what drives them. And, I think uncertainty and avoidance is another very important thing. Russia is very high in uncertainty and avoidance, and so are the Chinese. And we're less so here. We can live with uncertainty and change. We embrace that more. In these areas, they want to be certain of what's happening. So their level of thoroughness, they grow up learning to pay attention to the detail, to not gain fatigue in working on very detailed work for a long period of time. And we're going to talk about that when we get to autistic people as well. So if you understand your adversaries, you can do a lot more about countering what they do. And I think this is some of the new space that we have to look at. Who's attacking us? How can we defend against them? And importantly, how can we offense against them? You'll see our speaker, Tom Richards, in a little bit, but he certainly works in that area. He founded a company called Group Sense and co-founded it. And, they work on trying to figure out what's going on, looking down the dark web and other areas, and try to figure out for a client or for a company or for an entity or a country, is there a lot of chatter? Is there something happening? Are you beginning to be targeted? And so he has a group of people that are thinking in a broad sense, looking at data to amass that to draw narrow conclusions. And, I think that's part of Musashi, the whole concept of change the context. And then you can be a better defender and both offense and defense. And then understand your people. And if you do that, you can manage your people and use the right people, and you can understand your adversaries and do a better job. So we finally get to autism. It's a neurodevelopment disorder, as my wife tells me. This is one of her fields. She has many fields, but she's a counselor at this point in time. And, one thing I understand is the stigma of mental illness is incredible. It's something we're embarrassed about. And, somebody says, I have cancer, I have a heart problem, I had a heart valve release. replaced, and yet I'll talk to people about it. And I'm not embarrassed about it. My daughter has dyslexia. So I'm sometimes a little hesitant to say, yeah, my daughter's got, she got a couple of holes in her brain that, I caused probably because I'm dyslexic. You know, so there's a stigma with mental illness, but mental illness is a very broad spectrum. And autistics, we're talking about high performing autistics here. Just like we see some people, they can't add 2 and 2 together. They don't have a math brain. And other people think in calculus terms and data terms. But we don't look at those people as strange. There's a spectrum. And we need to figure out how to deal with that spectrum and to exploit it. And I was just, as I looked at my wife's research in this area, most of the counseling is focused on diagnosing and helping that person learn. But there's very little of helping them understand their particular strengths and how they can exploit them and use them. And I think that's something we need to think about. And importantly, when you're dealing with people different, they have a different culture. So you can ask an autistic today, how you doing today? They don't really know how to answer that because what's today and what's doing? Now, if you ask them, how do you feel this morning? They can answer that. So there's lots of things you have to learn. And I think Tom's going to cover that as we go forward. So I think I'm more encouraged that we can win this battle and we can limit threats. So we look at threats, we can limit it, and we can minimize risk. And that's what our future is. We can't prevent intrusions. We can only manage them better. So I'd like to turn this over to Tom, who's going to get on the specific topic we're talking about and give you some insight on that. And Diana is going to talk about a few references. Tom?
Thank you very much, Thad. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today. And happy St. Patrick's Day. If anyone breaks quarantine, sees Thad in person, make sure you pinch him because he's not wearing green. I just wanted to add that before we get started. Okay, so Thad has already introduced me. My name's Tom Richards, and as he said, I co-founded a company called GroupSense. We do a variety of work, investigations, and services focused around misinformation, counterintelligence efforts, cyber attacks, things like that. For today's presentation, we're going to be talking about autism, obviously. I've broken it down into 4 basic sections. A quick kind of overview level set with some definitions and statistics. Next, I want to talk about some work, research, and community efforts that have already been done or are actively being done. Then I want to talk about, that's within cybersecurity. Then I want to talk about autism in the workplace and opportunities. And finally, a special call out to a program that does a really great job with skills identification and training. I'm going to make a, excuse me, I'm going to make a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a counselor like Thad's wife. This is just a topic where I have some personal experience in working with folks, friends. It's a topic that I'm passionate about and I have a great deal of interest. At the end of this, I've got probably 24 references of material that can be checked out beyond this presentation. So I just want you all to keep that in mind as we go through this. All right. So Thad, you gave a definition already. I have one here from the WHO. I'm not going to read it, but I'll leave that to you. What I will say is that ASD can be demonstrated by sensory sensitivities with people. Thad, you mentioned difficulty with social interactions and confusion and communication, excuse me. And also, you know, your example of how are you today? There's sometimes difficulty in understanding the unwritten rules and expectations of certain situations. And we'll talk about the situations being, you know, engagements in the workplace, the job interview process, all sorts of examples. All right, so we have our definition. We have some behaviors. Let's talk about positives and how these traits can positively align with cybersecurity industry. So people with ASD are often very investigative and inquisitive. This is really an ideal trait because you have someone who's willing and dedicated to really drill down issues. As we said with my company, we're doing these investigations, gathering a lot of data, correlating it, analyzing it, things like that. It requires methodological principles and practices, a certain discipline that I feel like I lack. But that's a trait of someone with ASD. Also very logical. So as someone who has a bit of a Intel analyst mindset myself, and I'm working with analysts, it's really helpful for me, for folks who are logical, because that just eliminates bias. And speaking frankly, cuts through some of the BS that someone might add if they have a bias or a motivation. So a lot of positive traits, despite the stuff that we've talked about already. All right, moving on into some facts and figures here. Starting in the bottom right, often a diagnosis is made during childhood, between the ages of about 2 and 5 years old. But sometimes it can happen, or diagnosis can come to someone as late as they're in their 20s. So I guess a good lesson there is it's never too late to, like Thad said, don't feel stigmatized. Like, reach out, seek counseling, seek a professional if this is something that you're curious about in yourself, or even a loved one. The number we have in the top right, 1 in 60 people worldwide has been diagnosed. That seems like quite a high number. And actually, well, this comes from the WHO, and they actually expect that it is higher than that. And this is simply due to the fact that in parts of the world, it's difficult to get accurate numbers or diagnosis, and they aren't really looking out for it. So 1 in 60 is a bit of a lowball estimate, conservative estimate. Okay, next stat we have there, 4 times the diagnosis in males versus females. I found this particularly interesting. However, I couldn't find any reason why this is the case. You know, maybe just as young boys are so, having a newborn myself, are so wild and reckless, they're quicker to send their kids to the doctor. Who knows? In any case, let's talk about some of the proven causes of autism. And they range from a variety of genetic and environmental conditions. And as Thad said, people are stigmatized and underserved. Statistic to reflect that, we have 80% unemployment or underemployment for people with ASD. And this is kind of one of the guiding data points for my whole presentation, because there are certainly ways that this can be addressed, and plenty of reasons why we should. If you're curious about that stat, it comes from several NGOs and government organizations within Canada, the UK, and the US. So that being said, it could likely be very higher in other communities that don't have as much not only diagnosis but efforts to help folks with ASD. A little bit of speculation onto why that number is so high. You know, the hiring process often favors individuals with strong social skills, and that can be problematic for autistic individuals. So another thing, we have training is often quite rigid. People with ASD tend to be more self-taught and not really seek out like a typical training and certification program which validates their skills. They have the skills, they can develop the skills, but it's difficult to prove them. So I just, again, think that's a real opportunity for us to talk about the skill identification process, which we will, the hiring process, so on and so forth. Right now it's quite inadequate, but that's okay, because let's move on to ways to improve it. I have a timeline here. We have 4 points. This is just a small collection of presentations and different articles or reports that focus on autism that have come out of the cybersecurity community and IT security, IT community as well. I'll give you a brief overview of each of these. Again, I have the references for this stuff. I highly recommend checking it out. They're all just great for different reasons. So let's talk about that. Brian Kinghorn with Educating a Neurodiverse World. He is someone who has been diagnosed with ASD, and his talk is good because it talks about more than just autism, but a multitude of neurodiversity. He mentions and goes into detail about Asperger's and ADHD as well. What I liked probably most about this one was that he's got a lot of creative ideas for reframing education, for reframing training, and skill evaluation. So again, shares his experience and then actually has some good insights on things that have worked for him and other folks that he knows. The next one there, Autism and the Technical Security Industry from CREST. I wasn't familiar with CREST, and I'm going to read their description, so it's a bit wordy. It's an international not-for-profit accreditation and certification body that represents and supports the technical information security market. Like I said, a little bit wordy, but this report is good because it doesn't just focus on working with people with autism, but it also provides a roadmap for organizations that are interested in seeking a neurodiverse team. So Diana, you had mentioned this talk will be going out to HR groups and things like that. That is one of the resources that I would recommend. I almost said this next one is my favorite, but I think I have favorites for different reasons. So this third one, how can someone with autism specifically enhance the cybersecurity workforce, is my favorite for this reason. You have 3 people, 3 different perspectives. Rhett Greenhagen is someone who has had a very successful career working in the US government, as well as contracting and consulting. And he talks about his challenges, how he overcame them, etc. Dr. Stacy Thayer, she is someone who's like a subject matter expert. She's got a few books and other research on working with employee engagement. So again, from her perspective, another good utility for those HR groups. And then Mr. Hurt is someone who has worked with Greenhagen in the past, actually as his manager. So he talks about ways in which there was no manual for them. So they figured it out together and has become sort of a guiding light for them, and it's been helpful. So if you can't directly take away from those two in their relationship, then at least you can know that there's opportunity to figure it out. The last Daniel Brown. This talks about the challenges. Oh, I might be breaking up.
You cut out for just a moment, but you're back, so I think
Okay.
it's okay.
Okay, I just got a little message there from Zoom. So just to rewind a little bit, I've just read the title for that last bullet point there. So in this, Mr. Brown talks about the challenges in the existing mindset of the employment process. So calling out that stigma, the difficulties that exist, and he also makes recommendations for improvement. He also talks about training for individuals, and these training resources. You know, this isn't a plug. I don't have any affiliation with them, but I would recommend them. I've used some of them personally, so great for anybody. You have immersive labs, practice labs, Pen Tester Academy, e-learning security, Cybrary, Hack in the Box, and CTF 365. So things for folks who want to learn and enter the community can check out any one of those. All right, so these again are reports and other things in the community on a community basis. Now, professionally in the workspace, we have a number of notable organizations. I want to start with the Australia DHS, the Dandelion program. This was crafted in partnership with DXC Technologies, and it's a 3-year training program designed to equip individuals who are on the spectrum with the skills needed to enter IT and security. Now, the Dandelion program, you'll notice the theme of the slide deck as well is based on dandelions. This is intentional. The name comes from the kind of misperception of dandelions. So people commonly think it's a weed. They're always trying to get rid of it, work around it, what have you. But for folks who have the information, who are in the know, the dandelion can be actually extremely useful. People talk about teas and all sorts of other things. The dandelion root, the whole thing really has different uses. So with the right knowledge, information, so on and so forth, you can realize that this isn't a weed, and there's a lot of potential there. Something worth mentioning here is that the Dandelion program started in 2014. A few years ago, the resources for that have actually been open sourced through Cornell University, which means you can utilize those resources and adopt them for your own purposes, which I think is just really, really cool. Another bullet point to show that there's a lot of opportunity here. I'm going to mispronounce this. I've tried several times, but I just don't think I have the right language background for it. Specialistern and a little easier, Autocon. These are two IT and security consulting firms that focus on hiring neurodiverse individuals. What's great about these two is that they don't require previous experience, so they do the training and things like that. They help put people in jobs that are well suited to their particular interests, their particular skill set. And last time I looked, I believed globally, Autocon at least operates in several different countries, but globally they're hiring hundreds of people. And I think that Specialistern advertises about 75% of their employees are on the spectrum, something like that. in any case, a good avenue to start for anyone who might be looking for employment. Yeah, Autocon is in 8 different countries, so that's just great news. The last one here is the neurodiversity cybersecurity careers. This was a conference actually in 2017. And the reason this is notable to me is because it was put together by both private and public organizations in the UK. And they came together to raise awareness, talk about this, and you had very large consulting firms, might have been Accenture even, Thad. I can't remember exactly who they were, but it's a bit of a top-down approach, which is good. Whenever you have an event like that, you're raising awareness, which I think is very, very important. Again, links to that and these other resources will be at the end, so you can check out any of them individually. Okay, now, so far I've talked about a lot of research and other things that I've looked up and explored and things like that, but I want to shift now into a program that I've been involved with personally. This is the Cyber War Games. And I just think this program does a great job with overcoming a lot of the pitfalls that exist in current training and skills identification program, which typically, overlook neurodiverse individuals. It's hosted again by Australia, DHS, now known as Services Australia, actually. It's run by the company TLR Communications, and it's very interesting. It's a week-long program. I say experience. It's a week-long experience where people from the public sector and the private sector both get together. These are, cybersecurity practitioners, and they compete in a simulated cyber battleground. Is the terminology I'm using. If you want, follow up with me after. I can show you pictures. They've done some really cool setup where they have a whole city that's been automated. It's the city is built out of Lego and it's been automated. So you have different functions, critical infrastructure moving, and lights changing, and dams bursting, and trains derailing, an active working radar system. It's just so cool. But that's a little bit of a nerding out aside. In any case, we're bringing together these groups and presenting these groups, the participants, with digital hacking and defense scenarios. And it's designed to educate, train, and condition the people involved. So, if we're in cybersecurity, we're pretty much, all of us are going to face an incident if we haven't already. And that's why I think that last point is so important. Conditioning, an incident is not something you want to learn trial by fire. So the Cyber War Games is a great way to get some experience and kind of feel it ahead of time. Now, to bring it back a little bit, for folks on the spectrum, the games provide a really great opportunity to show their skills and their interest areas. I mentioned that there's a lot of these attack and defense scenarios. There's a broad range of them, and they're well defined as well. So there's bumpers, and this gives the opportunity for the person to just sit down in their chair and focus on their thing if they want. The games are also monitored, so the administrators can tell if someone is on the right track or not, and then help course correct. Again, this is very important. I mean, with ASD or not, anyone's going to get frustrated when they're just banging their head against the wall, so to speak. And so the administrators kind of moderating this is very important. Okay, so I mentioned the cyber war games offers the opportunity for people to just sit down and focus in their chair if they want, but it's also there's also opportunity for high-level strategy and team orchestration, which is great for managers and team leads. But it gives some exposure to people with ASD, but doesn't necessarily require that they just get forced into it. And in maybe a team interview or something like that, that's where it contrasts. You know, you're putting someone in the hot seat, and if they're not comfortable with that, they might not do well. I already mentioned that there's a lot of different challenges here, which allows for someone to really find what they're interested in. But I think the key point that I want to make about the cyber war games is that it's results oriented, and it's not something that requires you to solve the puzzle in the way that they expect you to solve it. Now, in an interview, it's almost like do the math and show your work in a lot of cases, at least in my experience. So the cyber war games is not like that. It's about results, and it's about merit. And so what I just remember was a lot of people who did well, they were maybe not necessarily used to being celebrated, which was a cool, I think it was just very rewarding. And I think it's clear that I'm of the opinion that there should be more opportunities like this than something so rigid. Okay, so kind of wrapping up here, I have, it's not my saying. There is a saying in software development, and I work with dev teams and doing product design and things like that. And we say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And I typically say this when we've developed something that isn't well understood by our users. Now, in that case, you know, I should probably have done a better job in designing it or getting specifications. But when it comes to autism, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And I think companies, teammates, everyone really needs to, another saying we have is RTFM. And if you don't know what that stands for, I'll let you look it up. But said another way, I'm just saying that we need to put some effort in to better understand who we're working with and their specific talents. There's plenty of resource education. I think I've outlined several sites and other programs that you can look into. So we're not necessarily paving the way, but we need to start moving the cart down the track. And further evidence of that, you know, we have an abundance of unfulfilled cybersecurity jobs, and we should be looking at different ways and tapping into new channels of talent. So with that, I will just finish up with this quote. The world needs different kinds of minds working together. And so I hope this has maybe inspired you all to feel a little bit in the same way, at least. So thanks again for your time. And with that, I think I'll pass it on to Diana.
Did you have a slide with your references?
Yes, I do. I'll pop that up. It's not the best to read because it's blue on black, but
I want to thank you for giving that talk. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it's not necessarily your expertise area, but I think it's one of the challenges of this autism and combining it with cybersecurity is that there aren't we're making great strides in improving and moving forward. And you've mentioned some of the wonderful initiatives out there that are coming forward, but it's something that we still need to continue to talk about more. We need to engage more of the field. And so getting people that are like you, enthusiastic and interested in the topic area to participate is what BCI wants to do, is what I want to do. And so as people have questions about this, we have a little bit of time today for questions. Feel free to write me and I will help try to get you in touch with people. I have a number of volunteers working behind the scenes that did a lot of research and reached out to a lot of different parts of the community. And so we may not be able to help you, but hopefully we can help start collecting those resources and putting them together and direct people to the right places. I just include a couple of additional references from Tom's. There's some very good information just about, in general, autism spectrum disorder. And there's a brand new initiative that is a university that will just be training people to do cybersecurity and are focused on the autism segment. In the US, I think that our perceptions are sort of fragmented. We have support groups at a state and a national level, and so it's a little bit more challenging to have an integrated picture. And so I think that's one of the areas that we can continue to improve here in the US.
Diana, can I also just add a note about Mercyhurst? They're one of the foremost schools for intelligence analyst education. So it's cool to see them on the list here as well. A lot of folks I know in my field have come from or gone through or have some affiliation with Mercyhurst. So recommend them highly as well.
Yeah, I love to see all the initiatives getting started. So I think that's wonderful. If there are questions, you can feel free to chat. And before I stop the recording, just a plug for our next webinar. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about misinformation, about the kinds of techniques that attackers use to change your view of how the world looks and how you can actually interact and find the correct information that you're looking for. And BCI I hold office hours every other Wednesday. It's a great place to find out what BCI is working on or to bring up new areas that you'd like us to talk about or consider. So I welcome everybody to come to those as well.
That misinformation presentation, I'm really looking forward to it. The presenter, Sarah Jane, is just an incredible woman. So again, I want to double plug that one.
Great. Thank you so much.